The 1980s didn't just boast the highest concentration of serial killers, it also featured some of the deadliest, and a lot of them may be people whose names you don't even know. Between 1982 and 1984 in Illinois and Indiana, Larry Eyler was known to have killed at least 21 young men and boys. That's not the whole story, though. What's remarkable is that he was caught and released twice. In 1978, Eyler offered a ride to a hitchhiker, Craig Long. Long declined Eyler's sexual advances, which caused Eyler to become violent. He stabbed Long and left him by the roadside, thinking he was dead. Long crawled away and contacted the police. Eyler then returned to the scene, telling police the stabbing was accidental. They found numerous weapons and handcuffs in Eyler's backseat, but he was released after his housemate offered Long $2,500 to drop the charges. Eyler was then arrested for solicitation in 1983. Police found weapons and handcuffs in his vehicle once again and notified a task force hunting for the highway killer. Authorities checked into Eyler and searched places where he was known to reside. They found enough evidence to arrest him for murder, but the searches were deemed illegal. Eyler's housemate then paid his bail. After Eyler was released, he committed one final murder, which ultimately led to his conviction. Better known as the .22 caliber killer, Joseph Christopher murdered at least a dozen people, mostly black men and boys, between 1980 and 1981. His first 4 slayings took place over a 2-day period, and these were actually the only murders where he used a .22 caliber weapon. He switched to stabbing or bludgeoning the rest of his victims. Christopher had actually been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia before his killing spree. He tried to admit himself to a psychiatric hospital earlier in 1980, but was turned away because he didn't seem dangerous at that time. 14 days after he was denied, he killed his first victim. When Christopher first joined the military, he attacked a black soldier. This incident led him to talk to an army nurse during his care. Christopher was virulently racist, confessing to the nurse that he had to kill black people. Christopher was convicted of 3 of the murders, but admitted to many more.
Why did you kill those people?
No comment. No comment. I cannot answer that at this time.
Richard Ramirez killed more than a dozen people between 1984 and 1985. Many of the murder scenes had satanic imagery, as he claimed to be a practicing Satanist. Richard had a very traumatic childhood. He suffered from a head injury at the age of 5 that left him epileptic. His father was abusive, and his cousin Miguel Ramirez regaled Richard with stories about his time in Vietnam, namely about torturing and abusing civilian women. These stories came alongside graphic, gory photos Miguel had taken while committing the acts he described. Richard was even present on the day Miguel murdered his wife. After numerous killings, Richard's eventual capture happened suddenly in Los Angeles. He left a fingerprint at a crime scene in late August of 1985, so police began publicly running his picture in the press. On August 31st, Richard Ramirez was recognized attempting to break into a car, chased down, and beaten by an angry mob in broad daylight. In early 1980, after several murders on the Sunset Strip in West Hollywood, police declared the deaths to be the work of a single serial killer dubbed the Sunset Strip Killer. After further investigation, it turns out there wasn't just one Sunset Strip killer, but 2. Doug Clark was a con man who had a history of talking his way into the homes of older women so that he had a place to stay. This was probably what he had in mind when he met a nurse named Carol Bundy. Soon, Clark was talking her into far more than that. He convinced Bundy to lure an 11-year-old residing in Bundy's apartment building into a sexually abusive relationship with him. Sadly, that was only the beginning. Clark started talking about his violent sexual fantasies, and surprisingly, she agreed to assist him. The pair killed and mutilated at least 6 people before Bundy got a guilty conscience. She confessed to an ex-boyfriend, but, fearing he might turn her in, killed him immediately afterward. Before long, Bundy was telling her co-workers that she couldn't reconcile the murders with her job as a nurse, where she was meant to save lives. Her stunned colleagues turned her and Clark in, but it's worth noting that Bundy admitted to the cops that she willingly participated in the slayings. While the Milwaukee cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer is most frequently associated with the 1990s, Dahmer was active in the 1980s as well. His first victim was actually in 1978, and while he wasn't as prolific until the early 1990s, he definitely qualified as dangerous.
I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons.
Dahmer was notorious for his brutal murders, mutilating the bodies of his victims and consuming their flesh and organs. His cannibalism hadn't really ramped up early on, so several of his murders from the 1980s ended up as trophies for the police to find. His eventual capture came in 1991. Police found a man named Tracy Edwards wandering the street with handcuffs around one wrist. Edwards told them about a strange man who had drugged and restrained him before he'd managed to escape. Edwards told them exactly where Dahmer lived, and upon investigating his apartment, they found heads and other body parts in his refrigerator and freezer. They also found extremely graphic Polaroid photos Dahmer had taken of himself killing and dismembering people. Dahmer murdered about 17 young men and was murdered himself in prison in 1994. One serial killer who terrorized New England between 1978 and 1988 was never caught, stalking the border between Vermont and New Hampshire. The Connecticut River Valley Killer committed a series of stabbings that left at least 7 dead. In fact, it seems that the killer only ended their spree because they were very nearly caught. In 1988, the killer attacked a woman named Jane Borowski, who stopped to get a drink out of a roadside vending machine. Although the murderer stabbed Borowski 27 times and left her for dead, Borowski, 7 months pregnant, managed to crawl back to her car and drive to a friend's house. On the way, she realized that the vehicle in front of her was being driven by the killer, but they drove off before anyone could apprehend them. When she reached her friend's house, the residents called paramedics. Borowski survived, as did her baby. Borowski assisted the authorities with as much information as she could manage, but they ended up never having enough to arrest anyone. While a few people have emerged as potential suspects, none were ever arrested or convicted for the crimes. After Borowski got away, though, what she shared with police must have spooked the killer. The Connecticut River Valley Killer disappeared after that. 2 of the 1980s deadliest serial killers actually teamed up and committed many of their murders as a duo. Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole met at a soup kitchen in 1976, where they quickly began a relationship. Lucas and Toole had both already committed murders on their own at this point, and things only escalated from there. They continued their killing and crime spree together until the early 80s, at which point they went their separate ways. What caused the split? Reportedly, Lucas became obsessed with Toole's 15-year-old niece, Becky Powell. Lucas and Powell started a relationship that ended with him murdering her. They were both arrested 2 months apart in 1983 for unrelated charges, and that's when the confessions began. It's not even clear how many they killed, together or separately, because both of the men were compulsive liars. They discovered that they could get special treatment in prison by confessing to every murder police asked them about, and going as far as backing up one another's stories, even if facts showed that they couldn't have committed the crimes. Lucas claimed to have killed 600 people, and Toole claimed 100 victims, but neither of these numbers are considered very likely.
I just made up my mind if law enforcement wanted phony confessions, I'd give it to them, so I did.
Lonnie David Franklin Jr., also known as the Grim Sleeper, committed a spree of murders in the 1980s, up until 1988, and then slept for 14 years, meaning he didn't kill again until 2002. It wasn't initially clear that his crimes were the work of a serial killer. He operated in the Los Angeles area, but there were a number of serial killers terrorizing the same area at the same time and killing the same sorts of victims, black sex workers. Police in the 80s were so overwhelmed they couldn't tell one murderer from another, so Franklin's killings simply blended in. In 2002, the murders began again. Investigators theorized that these new killings were the work of a serial killer and possibly connected to murders committed 20 years before. It wasn't until 2007 that the theory was confirmed. Franklin left DNA at a fresh crime scene, which linked him to at least 11 unsolved murders from the 1980s. In 2010, they finally matched Franklin's DNA to that of his son Christopher, who had been arrested on a weapons charge in 2008. It's also worth noting that it's not certain that Franklin was dormant during the entire 14-year period. Authorities say it's possible Franklin committed at least some murders during that time. Between 1979 and 1981, around 30 children, almost all young black boys, turned up dead in Atlanta. The choice of victims and the brutality and relentlessness of the killings began to inflame racial anger in Atlanta. Rumors spread widely that the Atlanta child murders weren't committed by a single serial killer, but by multiple members of the Ku Klux Klan. Authorities set up task forces and made numerous attempts to track down the killer, but to no avail. Finally, they decided to stake out a bridge that the killer had used as a dump site more than once. One night, police heard a loud splash as if someone dropped something into the water. They quickly pulled over a driver named Wayne Williams and arrested him. It soon became clear that they had caught him disposing of the body of a man named Nathaniel Cater. After further investigation, authorities found carpet fibers in Williams' car, his house, and on his person consistent with similar fibers found on most of the Atlanta child murder victims. In particular, they noted the presence of green fibers that matched the carpet in Williams' house. Williams was tried and sentenced to life for the murder of Cater and another adult, Jimmy Ray Payne. He has never been tried for the Atlanta child murders and maintains his innocence, but the killings stopped after he was caught. After a 2012 arrest for a drug charge, authorities tested Samuel Little's DNA and found a match to 3 murders committed in 1987 and 1989. Little was convicted of the murders and sat in jail for 4 years before he claimed responsibility for over 90 killings. It's not unusual for serial killers to inflate their murder counts, but Little's case was different because of the sheer detail of information he gave to police. Little died in 2020, but as of 2021, law enforcement agencies have confirmed that Little was involved in at least 60 of the 90-plus murders. This has already propelled him to the top of the list of most prolific serial killers, and investigations into the remaining 30-plus cases are ongoing. Little not only remembered where he committed his various murders, he even remembered many of their names and faces. He sketched portraits of his victims and often had unreleased details of the crimes, such as positions in which bodies were found. The evidence Little provided authorities is chilling in terms of scope and magnitude.
He remembered wardrobe, he remembered buttons on some of their clothing and zippers. This went back all the way to the 1970s.
Most disturbing of all is that he was able to kill for decades without arousing any suspicion. Before his confessions, no one even suspected these crimes were the work of a serial killer. Between 1980 and 1981, Interstate 5 was the stalking ground for a murderer dubbed the I-5 Killer, who sexually assaulted his victims before killing them. Police quickly came to suspect Randall Woodfield, who had previously been arrested for indecent exposure and a string of thefts where he also assaulted victims. 2 of the earliest victims were women Woodfield knew, but police didn't have enough evidence to convict him. Soon, Woodfield lost control and became less cautious while committing more and more offenses, from murder to petty robbery. He was positively identified by survivors of his attacks, which led to his arrest and conviction. While he was only convicted of a single murder and an attempted murder of another woman, DNA evidence has linked Woodfield to at least a dozen of the crimes, and it's possible he was involved in up to 44. One thing that particularly stood out about Woodfield was his day job. He was a professional football player and was even drafted by the Green Bay Packers in 1974, though he never made it onto the field during the season. The team cut him during training. While the team officially cut him for performance reasons, it is rumored that they found out about his numerous arrests for indecent exposure and kicked him out as a result. Throughout the 80s and 90s, the Green River Killer stalked Washington state, allegedly killing 7 people. In 1987, the police thought Gary Ridgway was the murderer, but they didn't have enough evidence to convict him. Luckily, the investigators did something that would later turn out to be crucial in the case. They took samples of Ridgway's hair. The Green River Killer case sat untouched for years until new DNA technology in 2001 triggered a re-examination of evidence in unsolved cases. It took nearly 15 years after the murders were committed, but DNA testing had finally advanced enough that those 1987 samples of Ridgway's hair could be definitively linked to the Green River killings. Police arrested Ridgway as he was leaving the factory where he worked. While Ridgway was only suspected of those original 7 killings, he struck a deal with prosecutors. He agreed to give details of other murders he had committed and plead guilty to each in exchange for life in prison, as opposed to the death penalty. He ended up confessing to over 70 murders, with nearly 50 of those confirmed by authorities, making him one of the most prolific serial killers ever. Serving 48 life sentences, along with an additional sentence of 480 years for evidence tampering, also makes him one of the longest sentenced criminals in United States history. Arguably one of the most terrifying aspects of the horrific crimes committed by Joseph DeAngelo known as the Golden State Killer, was the fact that he almost got away with it. The ex-cop's spree of murders began in 1975 when he murdered Professor Claude Snelling and ended with the assault and killing of his last known victim, Janelle Cruz, in 1986. D'Angelo murdered 13 people before the lack of substantial evidence turned his case cold. For over 30 years, it seemed like D'Angelo's victims would never get justice until a breakthrough was made in 2018. Investigators were able to use public genealogy databases to make a solid connection between DNA collected at the crime scene decades before and samples from the killer's family members. Law enforcement officers were then able to narrow their search to D'Angelo and confirm the match from DNA on a tissue that he placed in the trash. With the evidence stacked against him, the Golden State Killer pleaded guilty not only to the heinous murders, but also to a number of other brutal assaults. Dennis Rader was an extremely dangerous killer who evaded law enforcement for nearly 3 decades. On the surface, he blended into society. He was a family man, an average government worker, and an avid churchgoer. Beyond that persona, he gave himself the moniker the BTK Killer as he bound, tortured, and killed 10 victims. Throughout the 1970s, 80s, and up until 1991, Rader carried out his murders completely under the radar. However, in 2004, after a newspaper ran a 30th anniversary article about the BTK Killer's first kill, Rader couldn't help but jump back into the spotlight. He began sending messages to the police via postcards. After anonymously asking the police if they could track him through a floppy disk, authorities seized their chance to finally catch the BTK Killer. Once the police told Rader that it couldn't be linked to him, he sent the disk, and investigators managed to link his DNA to a sample collected at one of the crime scenes.
Anyway, you can get out the DNA, right?
You can't get out your DNA unless you've had a total blood transfer and lost every organ.
After confessing to the murders and showing disbelief that the police deceived him, Rader was given 10 consecutive life terms. In the early 1980s, the 4-man satanic cult called the Ripper Crew planned and carried out brutal murders together in a very short amount of time. From spring 1981 to fall 1982, it is estimated that the gang tortured as many as 20 women before murdering them using blunt objects, hatchets, or other bladed weapons. The Ripper Crew, comprised of Robin Gett and Edward Spreitzer, along with the brothers Andrew and Thomas Kokorales, was finally stopped in October 1982. A victim survived their vicious assault and went to the police. It was her account combined with those of other witnesses that led investigators to find the perpetrators and bring them into custody. Even though the brothers and Spreitzer confessed to killing multiple women, investigators were unable to confirm the exact number of victims. Andrew was executed in 1999 for murder, while Spreitzer and Gett both received long sentences and remained behind bars, with the former serving a life term. Thomas, on the other hand, was set free in 2019 after serving just half of his 70-year sentence. The remaining Kokorales brother then went to live at a Christian shelter for ex-convicts. William Bonin's crimes began when he started assaulting minors in the 1960s. Bonin would spend several years in mental hospitals and prisons, but before his incarceration in 1975, he told an officer that he would not leave a living victim next time. Once he was released in 1978, the murderer followed through with his claim and began a killing spree of 21 men and boys. Bonin was even more lethal due to the fact that he had accomplices, yet those same people turned on him after he was arrested again in June 1980 for assault. Their testimony, along with evidence like the wire and rope found in Bonin's van, led to a conviction and death sentence.